Good evening.
Good evening.
I hereby call this I'm back in November, this January the 14th meeting of the Public Safety Committee to order. As always, we'd like to take a moment and recognize all of our public safety personnel who work tirelessly to improve the quality of life for the people of this community. I'd like to recognize the brave men and women of the Winston-Salem Police Department, led by Chief Thompson. I'd like to recognize the brave men and women of the Fire Department, led by Chief Mayo. The brave men and women of the Emergency Management Department, led by Mr. Vernon. I'd like to recognize our city manager, assistant city managers, all the staff who help to make this city move every single day. Thank you for what you do for our community. We have several items, members of the committee, on the agenda, on the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda are unanimously approved unless a member of this committee or of the council wishes it to be pulled for consideration. If there are no items, then items are approved with one sweeping motion. Members of the committee, are there any items from the consent agenda that should be pulled for approval? If not, I would entertain a motion. Seeing there are no items needed to be pulled, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion properly seconded. All in favor, please vote yes. Opposers likewise. The consent agenda is unanimously approved. We'll move to item G1, please.
Item G1, ordinance amending Chapter 38, Article 1, Section 3810F of the Winston-Salem City Code to allow retired Winston-Salem police officers to utilize the firing range for concealed carry training and/or qualification under the Law Enforcement Officers Safety Act of 2004.
And here providing us information on this item is Assistant Chief Wilson Weaver. Chief Weaver, you have the floor, sir.
Good evening, Chairman Taylor and Mayor Pro Tem Burke and other members of the City Council.
Good evening.
Under the Law Enforcement Safety Act of 2004, this was an act that was enacted by President George W. Bush, which allowed retired law enforcement officers to carry concealed weapons nationwide if they meet the definition of a qualified retired law enforcement officer. And within that most recent 12-month period, the qualification requires that they receive training and qualify on their firearms with the agency from which they retired. The whole purpose behind this act was to give another layer of retired officers who still had that capability of being able to utilize their firearms to provide another act of safety or action of safety, especially in the event, if you think back to 2004, related to terrorism. So that's why the act was enacted in the first place. So what the police department would like to do is allow our retired officers to take advantage of the Winston-Salem Police Department firing range for the training and qualification. If that amendment has been changed and is proposed to the City Code Section 38-10, subsection F, it will allow our retired officers to use our firearms range for the training and qualification so that they will have the nationwide concealed carry purposes for the City of Winston-Salem.
Thanks, Chief Weaver. Are there any direct questions for Chief Weaver on this particular item? Mr. McIntosh is recognized.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Larson is recognized. Forgive me, sir. That's two Freudian slips.
Larson, I got you. Chief Weaver.
Yes, sir.
We'll be back.
First of all, thank you for your work on Sunday. I appreciate all the work the police department did to keep the city safe. Regarding the fire range, is this the active fire range? Would this include the virtual training range also?
Yes, sir. That would include the virtual training range also.
Oh, both aspects.
Right.
Okay.
But actually, the way the city ordinance was set up, it would not allow for a regular firearm or what discharges a bullet to actually be used unless we made this modification to the city ordinance.
Is it for the real fire
Correct.
range?
For the real firearms.
Yeah. Where's that located? Where's our fire range located?
Just off of behind Engine 3, off of 30th and Liberty Street.
30th and Liberty.
In the northeast.
You're well protected up there, aren't you? Thank you. Appreciate
Sure.
it.
Yes, sir. I believe that's called the Brookwood Business Park right now.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Larson. Now, Mr. McIntosh is recognized.
Is there any additional cost to the city of doing this?
No, sir. No additional cost to the city. As it stands, our retired officers will, of course, furnish their own firearm. It must be approved by our firearms instructors, and they will also have to pay for their own bullets.
Great. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this item? Seeing nothing further, I would entertain a motion.
Move approval.
The motion and properly seconded. All in favor, please vote yes. Opposers have the ability to do likewise. That is unanimous. Thank you, Chief Weaver.
Thank you.
Item G2, please.
Item G2, ordinance to regulate the use of electric scooters and manage shared mobility system operators in the city of Winston-Salem.
All right. I think one of our city attorneys is coming forward. So as she comes forward, Mr. DeCane, would you like to cue the item up, please?
Yes, sir. Good evening, Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Burke, members of the committee, and members of the City Council. Since the scooters made their appearance some months ago, our city attorney's office and DOT staff have been working diligently, and I can't tell you how much work has gone into this because I couldn't keep up with it. So I stopped ignoring the emails, and they're before you tonight to present what they've come up with. There's been copious amounts of research done with other communities, national standards, all those types of things. So what they're going to propose to you tonight is a draft ordinance for your input. And with that, I'll turn it over to City Attorney's Office.
Yes, ma'am, you have the floor.
Hello, committee members. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights of the ordinance, and please feel free to stop me to ask questions or offer comments. So this ordinance will apply to electric stand-up scooters. It will apply to dockless bicycles, which will include human-powered and electric-assisted, but the key is that they're dockless, not docked. And also to new modes of shared transport, and we're envisioning things such as pod cars in the future. We wanted to have something in place that addresses some of the new technologies that will arise. The article will apply to all of these devices, which we broadly term micromobility devices, and it will apply to those that are part of a commercial enterprise that employs a system of shared devices. It will not apply to privately owned micromobility devices, with a few exceptions. We do have some provisions which prohibit privately owned scooters and new modes of dockless shared transport in certain places, and which will prohibit the abandonment of those devices in certain places. We also have a helmet requirement, and we have an age limit requirement, which will apply to stand-up scooters. The director or her designee will be able to adopt further regulations, which will be housed in permit regulation documents, and those will also have the same force as the ordinance, because a violation of the regulations in the permit documents will also be a violation of the ordinance. So no one, if this ordinance is adopted, will be able to offer devices for rent in the public right-of-way without a valid operating permit from us. And those operating permits will only be valid in certain device operating areas that the director establishes, and with the consent of private property owners on private property. Operators will not be able to restrict the operation of devices to certain geographical areas within the operating device areas, and they will not be able to discriminate against low and moderate income persons. Operators will have to maintain a sufficient number of devices to satisfy customer demand within census tracts of low and moderate income areas of the city, as the permit defines. Operators will also have to implement a program to reduce barriers to rental by low and moderate income persons by providing diverse payment options at multiple locations throughout the city for people who have neither a smartphone nor a credit card. Operators will have to have the ability to discover and communicate when devices are operated outside device operating areas. Nobody will be able to use, display, or rent an electric stand-up scooter or a new mode of shared dockless transport on any greenway, public park, city parking deck, or within Old Salem. Nobody will be able to use an electric stand-up scooter on any public sidewalk, except to the extent necessary to dock the scooter and to retrieve it from the sidewalk. And nobody will be able to use a new mode of dockless shared transport on any public sidewalk. No one will be allowed to station or abandon any micromobility device in any public right-of-way or public area in a manner that obstructs travel on or blocks access to the public right-of-way, that poses a safety hazard, or is otherwise prohibited. Operators will also be responsible for the abandonment by customers of devices operated under their permits, and those devices will be subject to immediate impoundment, and the operators will be subject to civil penalties. The director may issue 2 permits for each category of device. The device categories are electric stand-up scooters, dockless bicycles, and new modes of shared transport, but the director will be able to issue more permits if the demand requires it. The director will be able to establish the number of devices operated under each permit and the mix of devices within operating areas to ensure equal access, distribution, access to the public right-of-way, safety, all those things. The director can adjust the number of devices once per week. Permits will be valid for 1 year, and operators will have to reapply and update their insurance certificates. Applications will be due June 1st of every year. The director will establish the application form, and council may establish the permit fees. Among other things, the application will include information sufficient to show that the applicant is financially, technically, and legally qualified to operate. It will contain a description of the applicant's proposed plan of operation, including their current operations here and elsewhere, the maximum number of devices they plan to use, their plan for balancing the devices for citywide coverage, their plan for inspecting, repairing, servicing, and maintaining devices, for maintaining adequate levels of staffing, for providing adequate customer service, their legal and regulatory compliance and history, their plan to implement safety programs and receive information and notify users about inappropriate use, their plan to educate customers about applicable laws, and other safety and usage recommendations and warnings from manufacturers and others. There will be a micromobility device operator selection committee that will consist of staff with appropriate knowledge and experience. The committee will review applications and rank applicants. Applicants will have 5 days from the date of the committee's decision to submit written comments and objections. The director will then review and decide, and the director may impose permit conditions. By accepting a permit, the applicant agrees to certain conditions. First is that they will execute an agreement with the city to indemnify, release, and defend the city at the applicant's sole cost and expense against liabilities that arise in connection with the city's issuance of the permit, the process the city uses in making a decision, the applicant's operations, acts, or omissions, including any failure to inspect, repair, service, or maintain their devices, and to communicate to customers, manufacturers, warnings, and recommendations with respect to any defective devices or equipment, the applicant's or its customers' injury to public property, to person, to property, to public right-of-way, any alleged or actual violations of law, and the applicant's breach of the agreement, as well as the city's failure to enforce provisions of the ordinance and of the agreement. The applicant will have to maintain an insurance policy that's satisfactory to us for 1 year following the expiration of the permit. The applicant's insurance policy will have to name us and their own contractors, including their chargers and their mechanics, as additional insureds on the policy. The permit will be suspended if the insurance policy lapses or is canceled. The applicant will also have to provide a bond or a letter of credit or other surety that's acceptable to us to cover their obligations under the permit. The indemnification obligations will survive the expiration or termination of the permit and the lapse of the insurance policy. Permits will be revoked, suspended, or denied by the director if an operator or anyone connected with them makes false or misleading statements or omissions on the permit application, if they fail to provide information or request, if they endanger the public health, safety, or welfare, if they violate laws, permit conditions, or our agreement, if they're convicted of criminal offenses that substantially relate to their qualifications to operate, if they fail to pay fines, impound fees, or civil penalties, and if the director decides that it's no longer in the public interest for the operator to operate in the city. If there's an immediate threat to the public health, safety, or welfare, the suspension or revocation will take immediate effect. All other suspensions or revocations will be effective 10 days after the date of notice. The applicant may appeal within 10 days of the date of service, and the city manager will designate a hearing officer to hear the appeal. The hearing officer's decision will be final. The applicant's failure to timely request an appeal will be a waiver of the right of appeal. We'll also be able to immediately impound devices that are operated, rented, or abandoned in the public right-of-way in violation of the ordinance. We will impose impound fees, which will cover the cost to investigate, enforce, impound, and store devices. And people will need to demonstrate proper proof of ownership and pay all applicable impound fees and civil penalties before they can retrieve devices. Provisions which are applicable to customers or users of the devices. So So anyone using a dogless bicycle or electric stand-up scooter must be at least 18 years old. And that's an age limit that we can change if the committee desires. Anyone who uses an electric stand-up scooter must also wear a helmet, and everyone must follow applicable traffic laws. Operators and people operating without a valid permit will be subject to civil penalties. Abandonment of a device operated pursuant to permit will subject the operator to a civil penalty as well. The civil penalty will be $250 per violation and $50 each day for each device impounded until the later of the date on which the operator lawfully retrieves their device or pays all impound and civil penalties. The operator will also pay any costs we incur as a result of the violation. They can appeal the civil penalties. They can do that within 10 days of the date of notice of the service of penalty. The city manager, again, will designate a hearing officer to hear the appeal. The hearing officer's decision will be final, and the failure to timely and properly request an appeal will constitute a waiver of the right of appeal. And that's basically the gist of the ordinance.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that was a detailed presentation. Now, we actually had these scooters pulled from the streets because at one point in time we felt like they were a public safety issue. I think that we put a good plan in place to ensure the safety of the public. Now, we can't ensure that nothing will happen, but I think we put a plan in place to make sure that our citizens are safe. Members of the council, I would recommend possibly lowering the age of operation. I think if at 15 or 16 our young men and women can operate vehicles, I think it will be reasonable to believe they can operate a scooter. But I think other than that, I think we've got a good plan. So are there any questions directly for our attorney? Yes, ma'am.
I need
Councilmember
a
Burke.
question. When you stated that the poor, how would you know if I did not have the finances to give me what I would need to be able to ride one of those?
I'm sorry, council member, how would I know that you don't have the finances?
Monitor people who would like to ride the scooters but cannot afford to ride the scooters.
How will we monitor, like, the missed opportunity, people who would have ridden if they'd had the financial?
But you stated earlier, you've already stated it, so I want to know how you're going to monitor it.
Yes, council member. We didn't put a lot of specifics pertaining to those specific requirements because we thought we would put the onus on the companies for providing the solution as to, you know, how are you propose a plan to us? How are you going to make sure that these scooters are accessible to everybody, and that they have a way to rent them, and that they're physically accessible. As for the technical details, probably my colleague Matthew could speak to those better, but that was our thinking.
Yes, because I had seen someone without means. I shared it with the city manager, trying to see if one of them he could use. Then he found out he couldn't because he didn't have, I guess, the money to put into it.
I understand.
Mr. Burchett, would you like to come up and address Councilmember Burke's concern? Mr. DeCane.
Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Burke, one of the requirements within the ordinance is that these firms have to provide a tremendous amount of data to the city. And that's sort of in line with the national trend, that these scooters will show up and they'll stay in one location within a municipality, and it's not shared equitably across the population. So the data that these firms collect, and that's really the primary business that they're in. They provide scooters and they do these other things, but the data they collect is really the most important thing, believe it or not. And so the city is requiring access to that data so we can see who's paying and how and where they're riding those scooters, and that will help us get to the point that you just made.
Well, I noticed the ones before they had to move them, they were all over everywhere. And there were people who wanted to but could not really afford it. So that information is important, Mr. Chairman, for me to know.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. McIntosh.
Obviously, legal department had a lot to do with this. What other staff departments were involved in drafting this? I mean, obviously, Matthew probably had a hand in this, but I mean, I'm just looking to see that this was sort of vetted by more than just one or two.
Yes. So the Department of Transportation, our public safety attorney, Lori, also took a look at this, and of course the city attorney and Mr. DeCane and Ms. Neek and Mr. Burchett.
And how much of this is our own sort of original draft, and how much of it was crafted
Yes.
for others' experience?
Yes. So it's based primarily on Santa Monica's ordinance. Santa Monica is the home of Bird Scooter. Then we also pulled provisions from Durham's ordinance, Greensboro's, a little bit from Raleigh. We kind of did a melange of things which appealed to us and then tweaked them for our own purposes.
You answered my question about education and communication. That was one of my big sticking points with their representative, is they kept saying, yes, we'll do that, we'll outreach, and there never was anything done about that. So I'd like to see what their response is going to be to that as to how they're going to do that. It will not be easy. Something that we've talked about, Mr. Attorney, where does the fine money go? Does this go to the school system and the courts, or does this fine money come back to us to help? We're going to have some costs involved in this, which is why I'm asking.
They're all civil penalties, which means it comes back to the city. It's not a criminal violation for the reason we discussed. When you have a criminal violation plus a civil penalty, technically it should be going to the city. So the violations are all considered to be civil.
Great. Another one of my big rubs with the company was when the hack occurred and we were seeing underage kids. How do we put concrete around that? How do we make the company respond to us? Is it as simple as we see a new phenomenon that occurs, we ask them for compliance, they don't give it to us, and we yank them?
Yes, that's part of it
Have
as
a
well.
nuclear option in this?
Right, and we also, yes, we can certainly pull the permit. We have the discretion to do so if we feel it's not in the public's interest any longer. That's a catch-all category, as well as for violations. One of the factors that we look at in deciding whether to grant the permit is their plan with respect to compliance with laws, including those which pertain to data privacy, data breach. They're the red flag rules, as I'm sure you're familiar with. And so if they don't provide a plan which satisfies us and which shows how they're going to comply with those laws, then we don't issue them the permit in the first place. But as Mr. DeCane said, we're also collecting data, and I expect that some of the data we'll collect will have to do with any breaches they experience.
Are we being asked to forward this to full council tonight? Okay. Okay. There's going to be intense interest in this. It's a very dense document. I want to take time to go through it more thoroughly, as I'm sure other people in the community will, but seems like it's pretty well crafted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. DeCane.
Yes, sir. Chairman, members of the committee, it would be reasonable to hold this item in committee considering the amount of information that's in it. It is for action. If there's just some minor changes, we can bring it forth to the full council. It is being heard by the Public Works Committee tomorrow night as well.
I think it's important that we act on it quickly, but I also think it's important to get feedback from the community and from us as council people, because there's a lot in this. I don't think we're losing a lot of business or activity on them with being in the middle of the winter. Every weekend, snow, rain, whatever. I think we're okay. Thank you.
And Mr. McIntosh, we can hold this as long as, and other members of the council, we can hold this as long as we need to, but we did promise, the people that we would take a look at this in January, so I think it's incumbent upon us to move forward as quickly as possible. I'm going to move to Mr. Larson. Before I do that, I've just got a question that Mr. McIntosh brought up, young people. That's something that I've always been and still am passionate about. So in the event that someone who's underage was found to be operating a scooter, what would be the process as far as the legal ramifications are concerned for those young people?
Right, so they will not be subject to either criminal or civil penalties. The civil penalties are only applied to operators and people who seek to rent those devices without getting a permit from us. We have no criminal penalties in the ordinance. The most would be impoundment for violation of the couple of provisions that apply to the owners of private scooters. So abandonment in the public right-of-way in a manner that obstructs it or endangers the public health and safety.
Great. Now, I know the police department would just be doing their job, but we don't want to create records for people, before they had an opportunity to get out and to be in the workforce. And that creates a whole new set of problems. Mr. Larson.
This is a very dense document. It's very legal. 18 pages, comprehensive. Congratulations for really laying it out. I'm going to have to take more time to look at it. I do have a couple of basic, questions about it. There's a lot of references to the director being responsible for certain additional activities.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on who that directly is? Are we talking about director of
Yes, the director.
transportation?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are we talking about assistant city managers? Are we talking about city manager.
Who's the lucky?
Who is going to, and so, and the question of, and so the next question is, how is this being staffed? Because I see enforcement issues coming to play very quickly. I also see a lot of legal review initially for the first couple of years till we train these operators that we're serious about what we're doing. And so I'm trying to understand what the costs are to the city and how we plan to recover those costs. At this point, I wasn't clear about what the fee structure was that we plan to recover. Before I can approve anything, implementing anything on the city streets, I would like to know how we're going to pay for it and what our costs are going to be. And I did notice a couple of concerns that I had, specifically what little bit I was able to read quickly on this document. And one was, I understand that it's a 72-hour period for it to be constituted as abandoned. I think that's excessive. 3 days is pretty excessive, and I think we ought to reduce that to at least maybe 48, maybe even 24 hours as abandonment, because they're either going to pick them up and repair them and place them or whatever, but if they're laying in front of somebody's shop, you know, illegally, I don't think 3 days or even 2 days is acceptable. So I think I'd like to look at the time period. I'm also concerned about the visibility of these particular vehicles on the streets at night when they are ill-equipped with inadequate lighting and are out on public streets. I've observed particularly that they are not visible, do not have safety lights on them, and I want to know who can control or what the controls can be provided for daytime only operation, dawn to dusk, whatever we want to call it. Right now, I mean, allegedly they shut down at 9 o'clock or whatever. Well, that's 5 hours after dark here. So, you know, I think some provision as to realistically what time of day we should allow or night we should be allowing these vehicles on our streets and look toward that safety provision. I would agree with council members that I think we could look at the age a little bit on that. I figure if they're old enough to have a driver's license or a permit, that maybe we can allow them to ride a 20-mile-an-hour vehicle of some sort. And so we may want to lower that age just a little bit. I'm not anxious for 12-year-olds to be on these things. I think otherwise I'll take my time and review the fees and the fines. I think they should be strong enough and durable enough to make a real impact, particularly if we're going to end up having to go around picking these things up and impounding them. I think a car getting impounded is a couple $100 to get it out of a garage, $300, $400 to get it out of a garage. And I don't know what happened to all the 300 or 400 that we picked up last time when we actually went and picked them up. It was a great service to Bird Company that we gathered them up for them and all in one place for them, presumably to come get them without fee. So that would be a question I will be looking at as well.
Thank you, Councilmember. So I believe we have a place where we say that council can establish the permit fees, and those can take various things into account, so that's something we could look at further. Impound fees, the director will adopt to cover our costs for impounding, investigating, enforcing, storing the devices. With respect to the visibility of the vehicles, I understand you want to establish maybe some time limits and perhaps some reflective devices or something that makes the vehicles more visible. And I believe that Public Safety, the police department, is also, we're expecting some input from them as well from their perspective on safety issues. And you mentioned, Councilmember, perhaps paring down the 72-hour period for the abandonment of scooters to 24 or 48 hours. I wanted to ask you with respect to dockless bicycles, we have 7 or more consecutive days. Is that time limit sufficient, or did you want an adjustment there as well?
For bicycles as well?
For them to be
bicycles?
deemed abandoned.
I think if it's abandoned and laid against somebody's property or on the sidewalk, we need to get them removed. I mean, the problem oftentimes we have around here is, well, it takes 3 days to do anything, and then we get out there and inspect them. It takes another day to pick them up, you know, and next thing you know, a week has gone by, and you know, no. We can be a little more attuned and responsive to this. And I think if we are responsive and quickly enough to do that, that we'll find that the problem disappears more rapidly. So if we could look at that. I guess my question to staff and to you is, you know, so how do we, this ordinance covers a great number of things, but there are a number of things it doesn't cover. And I'm not really comfortable entirely approving an ordinance to implement, to encourage these companies to come back onto our landscape until we're clear about what the fines are, the structure is, some of these details that are not covered in this ordinance. How do we actually know that those are in place before we start signing on companies? And how do the companies know what the standards are before they come to Winston-Salem as to some of these questions that we still may have that the director is going to resolve?
Yes, and council member, I think we wanted to leave ourselves some flexibility in terms of the fee schedule so that we could adjust them as time progresses without needing to come back each time for every increase. But if that's something you prefer to see in the ordinance itself rather than in a collateral document, we can do that as well.
I would like to see it before we implement a resolution or whatever to reestablish that business on our landscape. I think everybody needs to know that. They need to know that. If they're going to come back and apply to come into Winston-Salem, they need to know what the landscape is they're working against. So some of these questions that we're raising, both in the marketability, the number of kinds of people that can get on the scooters, some of these details need to be clearly defined, at least initially, in some codicil or something that allows us and them to understand some of the parameters. Now, we will probably undoubtedly make some adjustments as we realize how these things actually work and they merge into our transportation systems. But to start out, for both the users and the businesses themselves, the more clarity that we can have in how we're handling these things, I think the better off everybody's going to be.
And Mr. Larson, not only do I agree with you about how we put parameters around businesses, we also have to also keep in mind that there will be independently operated scooters. And an example of that would be just the cutoff time. Sure, an independent a company would pick theirs up at a certain time, but someone who got a gift for Christmas or who bought one just as a mode of transportation wouldn't sort of be able to adhere to that. So we'd have to make a blanket ordinance. And not only companies, but for independent operators. I'm sure that's probably not addressed in the ordinance. Councilmember Adams.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know whether you said it. It might be in here. I haven't read it. The average age of other cities for operation of this vehicle, these mobile devices. Is there any, and within the document, is there any requirement that the operators have training available to the community for free and or a minimum fee? Is that in there?
We have a requirement that applicants show us how they propose to educate their users. It's not very specific, but it does require them more specific.
We need to be able to train people who want to ride them, but are somewhat hesitant. But we also need to be able to provide training and safety instructions, just like driving or anything else. And because they're going to make big money, it's not like we're going to get any of it, a little bit of it. Yeah, a little bit. But they need to go ahead and contribute to the public good and goodwill of the people and us by providing some training to the community. And I'm sure Chair is in here that every time they want to increase their stock, just like limos, they have to come back or cabs to you, right? This committee.
Correct.
Correct. Okay.
Councilwoman Scipio.
Thank you, sir. The director of DOT is going to be a very, very busy person with all the things you put in there for that person. The committee that is going to be established, was there some discussion about why it needs to just be staff and that no residents would be involved in that?
Community, the citizens from the community?
On that committee that determines the permitting.
We didn't have discussion about involving citizens in the selection committee, only staff members who maybe have some experience with scooter or micromobility device issues, but certainly I think
I really think that we need to always try to put citizens into our processes as much as possible, because they may have some input that the staff's not thinking about. I think another concern that I saw was that I know this applies to just the commercial devices. However, I'm really concerned about the private ones. Whatever we do for these devices needs to be able to apply to the citizens. So here you're demanding a helmet for the commercial ones. That needs to apply to just the private citizens as well. So I know the ordinance is for the commercial, but we need to have this document written so that any operator. I don't know how you can enforce something if you, I know the bird cycles have little gizmos, they have a little tag on it, but when it comes to enforcement, you're going to have some without the tag, so you'll know that's a private citizen,
Right.
I guess. So I'm also concerned about enforcement. What are we demanding of the persons who are to enforce all of the regulations? Do we have one or two officers or somebody, a citizens review group that goes out and do something about looking at are they in compliance? I think that's a burden to put on our law enforcement officers for scooters. But I think we need to be creative about how do you enforce all of these regulations outside of permitting and the electronic things that you can have access.
Are you saying we need bird watchers?
Bird watch.
Absolutely.
And Councilwoman Scipio, I think another thing to think about is, when we talk about fee schedules and revenue generated, as it was brought up several times, maybe some of that money, people don't like the word earmarks, but some of that money could be earmarked and used to compensate officers or, folks who are on the streets and doing the job. Because I think our police officers' time are better spent on the streets and doing their job. But this is something else productive that we put on their plate, so we should be able to pay to compensate that. I think Mr. Larson wanted to speak to that point, and I'll come to you, Councilman Rubis.
The way it's designed right now, there are districts where these things will be allowed to operate. Is that the way the ordinance is being
Yes,
written
there'll be
right now?
device operating areas.
There'll be operating areas, and so that would indicate that there'd be some parameters as to enforcement areas and visibility and cost and whatever. As we look at citizen participation, I would highly encourage that if we're going to form committees, that we use representatives from those districts who are most impacted or advantaged by these particular vehicles. If you could add that to the list. We're really getting down to the weeds here, but
That's good.
That's what we came to do. Mr. Bessie.
Yeah, this is also on Public Works tomorrow, and I'd originally intended just to discuss it there, but I thought, there's such a good turnout here for the committee this evening. This is an important point, enforcement, and I was pleased to see that staff, I think keeping in mind the concerns that you had raised, Mr. Chairman, took my suggestion. I think the primary enforcement mechanism is found in the sentence that reads, micro-mobility devices in violation of provisions are subject to impoundment by the city. So basically, Byrd or whomever stands to lose the vehicle if they're not able to keep the operation within acceptable perimeters. And we can insert details like the fine that they have to pay to get it back, and we could ratchet it up. One that's being operated on the sidewalk, maybe they have to pay $100 fine. One that's being operated in the middle of traffic in a reckless and dangerous manner, maybe they have to pay, $300. We could end up with a bunch of these bikes that they don't find it, economic to buy back, but that's a cost to the company, and we avoid having to, in this ordinance, I think Councilmember Scipio's suggestion that we need also to look at how we deal with the private owned ones is right, but I would suggest that we consider doing that in a separate ordinance, because in this one we have the opportunity to make the primary enforcement mechanism against the commercial company, and therefore not have to get into the difficult question of who do we penalize if we've got a 16-year-old riding one of Bird's bikes, or not bikes, one of Bird's scooters out there. Well, we have confiscated the scooter. And so, the penalty is hitting the company economically, as opposed to having to, go into the question of, well, is it a civil penalty? It's a minor. How do we deal with that? That's a very reasonable question that we can deal with in a separate ordinance. Just my thought.
I think it may be cleaner to, if we're going to regulate private scooters, to have a separate ordinance for them. We have a few provisions in this one that pertains to private users, like the helmet requirement pertains to private and commercial. But if we're going to do it more broadly, it would probably be cleaner to have a separate ordinance.
But I don't think that's an ordinance that we need to discuss 6 months later. I mean, it's something that needs to come directly behind what we approve. So yeah, I'm open to it. That's an excellent suggestion. Is there anyone else that wishes to be heard on the subject? Councilwoman Scipio.
Are you going to put in the ordinance the districts where they're going to be allowed?
We could do that. Yes.
I didn't see that. I think as inclusive as we can would be better for the public.
Certainly, certainly.
All right. If there's no further discussion, I think we have provided many details for the staff to go back and look at.
Thank you.
But as it's presented, it's been hard. You put in a lot of hard work, and we appreciate that, and we look forward to seeing it when it comes back to committee.
Thank
you.
And she did a very nice presentation.
Very nice presentation.
Very lawyerly.
Thank you.
Very loyal.
Item G3, please.
Item G3, presentation on the city's nuisance abatement process.
Giving us this information is our public safety attorney, Attorney Sykes. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Burke, and City Council members. I am just going to give you a brief overview of this issue. If you have any questions, of course, I'm happy to answer them. As part of the city's commitment to addressing nuisance properties, the City Attorney's Office and the Police Department have been reviewing the practices and procedures that we use to make sure that what we're doing is the most efficient and the most successful. And in looking at that and doing that review, we realized that the police department's general order on this issue was outdated. And so this is just an overview of what we have done to update that. This PowerPoint is in your materials. There we go. I will note that due to a little downloading glitch, I'm going to scroll through instead of going one by one. But what our policies are based on is the General Statutes of North Carolina, Chapter 19, which defines nuisance under state law. And it's divided up into two different types of nuisances. This first one is if you have a property that is built, established, used, otherwise maintained for the purposes of prostitution, gambling, alcohol that is being handled in illegal ways, or controlled substances, then that under state law can constitute a nuisance. The second type of nuisance under state law is just the ownership, the maintaining, or the use of any property or place where you have repeated breaches of the peace. So the first one is specific, the second one is a little more broad, and so we look to the definition of breach of the peace, acts that disturb the public order, and they are serious acts: homicides, assault, fights, communicating threats, weapons offenses. Under state law, in this definition, some things that you may think of in common sense being a breach of the peace are not under the statute, and that would include noise complaints, trespassing, larcenies, traffic accidents. Those simply don't fall into the category of breach of the peace that we can use under state law. The other thing I want to note is that in 2013, the state changed the law to say that if you want to address a property as a potential nuisance based solely on alcohol violations, that authority is now just with ALE and the state. The city can no longer pursue that if that's the sole basis for your nuisance action. So under our previous procedure and the former general order, a case officer who was involved in an incident where there was contraband seized or someone arrested for a list of violations, then they were required to submit a request for nuisance abatement letter, and they dealt with the senior office administrator for their division, be it SID or patrol, etc. Then for subsection B of the old procedure, for a property identified as an origin of nuisance activity, so not tied to a particular incident, the case officer would again go to their senior office administrator, provide certain information, and then notification letters would be generated to the property owner and those in the vicinity. Again, under the old procedure, when a notification letter was initiated and it had to do with just subsection B, which was identified as an origin of a nuisance, then that property was designated mandatory IR, which is an incident report, which means that anything that an officer dealt with at that location had to be put into a report as opposed to just field notes or case notes. The chief of police had to sign all notification letters. Follow-up was assigned to the crime prevention unit, and then the public safety attorney's office was to keep copies of all those notification letters. Based on what was determined to happen with that property in the next 60 days, it would either be considered active because there were more violations occurring, breaches of the peace, inactive because nothing else had occurred within that time period, cleared, and the reference in the policy was that the individual causing the problem had been evicted, and so there was no further follow-up needed, or referred, which is sent to the city attorney's office because the situation was egregious enough to warrant immediate action by the city attorney's office. There had been no revisions made to this general order since 2000, so it was severely out of date, and we also, again, in reviewing what were the best practices in dealing with these properties, determined that we were not really following these procedures as we should have been according to the general order, so there was the need to update it. What we have in place now, or are working on, is that any officer in the agency, whether or not they've made an arrest or seized contraband, can say, I believe this location might meet the criteria and I would like someone to look at it. What happens then is the officer will get a calls for service report of activity of the past 5 years, get the tax listing so we can determine who owns or leases the property, get a list of surrounding properties, and send all this to my office. When we get that material, my legal assistant and I will review that, and we'll analyze the calls for service to see if this property is a potential nuisance per the definition under state law. So what we'll do, we'll go through if there's a noise ordinance violation, if there's a trespass, if the property is listed only because a traffic accident occurred in front of it, we will call those out because those can't be counted. And then we'll take that report and we'll turn it to the officer, and then they will generate the nuisance abatement letter. We've updated the form letters. They will be sent to owners, tenants, and citizens in surrounding properties to let them know that this activity is going on. The draft letters are reviewed by the division commander and by my office, and then once finalized, they are signed by the division commander, and they are delivered, mailed to those folks that I mentioned. Again, once any letter has been sent out, it's a mandatory IR location, meaning that we are monitoring what's going on at that location and seeing if there are any further breaches of the peace or issues. And our office also maintains a spreadsheet, and we will track all letters that are sent out for follow-up purposes and for information purposes. Within 60 days of a letter going out under this new procedure, we will get an updated calls for service report, and again, we will know if there are any further violations or issues going on. If there are not, we'll consider it inactive. If there have been further issues, then we will forward that to the city attorney's office for consideration of legal action. And then we also wanted to leave in this, or put in this new procedure, the situation where there may have been only one incident that happened or two incidents that happened. It's not a long, drawn-out pattern, but those incidents, bless you, are so egregious that we feel like immediate action is necessary. So we have a provision for single incident notification letters that officers request will follow the same procedure and get those notifications out. These are what we believe are the benefits of updating the policy in this way and following this new procedure, that any officer at any time can request that we look at a property. All they have to do is call, email, stop by, and our office will do that. We are taking away from the case officer the burden of trying to apply legal definitions, case law, and those kind of discretionary factors that we really don't expect them to have to keep up with. That's what we are there for them. We'll ensure that only relevant calls for service are counted as to the property owner so that we don't have anything in there that they should not be held responsible for. We've removed the burden of follow-up from the crime prevention unit and put it onto my office so that we can free them up to do what they're doing out in the community as far as the paperwork goes. And again, we maintain the ability of the police department to address single incidents as they see fit. Finally, this will give us centralized record keeping as opposed to it being distributed between the senior office assistants in different divisions. It will be in one office, and all letters, notifications, and communications will be tracked by that office. And again, we hope that this will help us identify problem locations, track the progress that we're having in dealing with them, and make the whole system, again, as efficient and successful as possible. So that's what we have. That's working through the police department's internal review process right now to update this general order.
Attorney Sykes,
Yes, sir.
I'm glad you actually came to this committee and presented this information. There are many communities in our city who don't have to worry about nuisance abatement. But then there are many communities in our city that do have to worry about nuisance abatement. And I think the message we want to send today is that you don't have to put up with it. I mean, if there are drink houses, drug houses, any houses that breach the peace or have repeated acts that disturb the public order, we have tools in our toolbox to address that in our communities. Oftentimes in communities, they feel like because they live there and it's been the normal way of life, well, we just have to put up with that. And we're saying here today that you don't have to put up with it. And we've heard from our public safety attorney, and we've heard from the representatives from the city and the police department, and we will do our best to address that. So with that being said, we'll start with Mayor Pro Temp, and we'll just work our way around the table.
Yes, we started looking at the nuisance abatement a long time ago. And I guess the question, and thank you for your report.
Yes, ma'am.
Is what motivated you to look at it again, looking at an outdated something? Why we had, not only your department, but other departments, Mr. City Manager, we need to review policies to make sure we are up to date. So what motivated you to have to come and bring us an updated policy?
It was, again, in some of the efforts that have been undertaken lately, the primary responsibility had fallen on the city attorney rather than the police department. We work together. But honestly, it's just we do try to go back and look at policies regularly. This one, honestly, had just slipped through the cracks. And so as soon as we realized that it was out there and that we were realizing that different procedures were better, then we addressed it.
The reason, because we had that abatement problem in one of my neighborhoods. We got more than one neighborhood. And I guess maybe they did get something done as far as that house, but it continues to be a nuisance, and that's because we weren't updated. Okay. Thank
Well, I hope that this will take care of that.
I would also add that with the formation of the nuisance abatement task force, part of that task force job is to look and make sure the paperwork, policies, and procedures are up to date so we can basically accomplish what the council wants to accomplish.
Okay. Members of the committee, we have about 15 minutes to get out of here in good form. So we'll try to run through it and get through the next item. So we'll just work our way around the table.
Yep, two brief ones.
McIntosh.
The problem that my neighbor in the North Ward and I deal with is, or in the area around the university, is primarily alcohol problems, and those are excluded from this process.
They are, but I can assure you that we work very closely with ABC and ALE, and they have never failed to assist us when we identify properties to them.
That's what I wanted to hear. And then just one note on the contact the people who are contacted when there's an issue. I would, whenever possible, if you can identify a property manager, throw them in that list of contacts.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. McIntosh, I also serve on the ABC board, so if there's anything you need me to pass forward to LD, we'll be happy to do it. Mr. Larson.
It appears that what this is doing is the interface between the eyes in the field, that is the police force, that are out there actually looking at these houses and problems and whatever, and how it then transfers over into the legal department where enforcement ultimately will be a legal action by the city. And it appears to me that this is a streamlined program that clarifies what those responsibilities are, and I applaud you for doing that. I am disappointed that the one thing that does not seem to be authorized under state enactment deals with noise abatement, where we have loud clubs running at night and we're not able to quiet them down in neighborhoods. And I don't know what the city attorney's opinion on all of that is, but I consider that a nuisance.
Use the other tools that are available.
Thank you, and I'm sure when they arise again, I will be in contact with you. Right.
Again, just as the chair said, we grew up with liquor houses, gambling houses, drug houses. And again, because it became part of the normal landscape in our communities, a lot of us and our folks just assumed that we had to live with it. But I think in the world we live in today, they're looking for us, Chairman Taylor, to do something more to help them be able to report, yes, their neighbors, their relatives, and others who continue to wreak havoc on the community. I look forward to working with you guys and the people in the city and the North Ward because, you know, we have our issues in the North Ward too. I think over the years people think that the drug houses went away because of the freedom of the opioids and heroin and stuff, but they haven't. You still have the traffic that comes and goes all day in a neighborhood or a street where everybody on the street is over 60, 70 years old. And they're not the ones living in that house doing that. And they feel, you know, captured, imprisoned in their own neighborhood on the street. So I'm looking forward to see what we can do to put some teeth in this and help bring back some of our communities.
Thank you. Mr. Bessie.
Mm-hmm.
Interjurisdictional law question. Given the manner of business currently in Washington, are we still allowed to do something more efficiently?
Only that.
All we can do is try.
He waited for an answer too. Like,
good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Scipio.
I just had a quick question. My issue is once somebody has reported a disturbance or something that fits this abatement issue, what is the real turnaround time? This is reading like it takes 60 days before a letter can go out. That means the situation is continuing. Is that what happens? And then the next step is to just have a letter go out?
Oh,
what happens after that?
Attorney Sykes.
It's actually the way this works is that the turnaround is much shorter than that to get the letter generated. The officer would gather the information that's either that they have observed or that's been reported to the police department. We would go ahead and generate the letter. The 60-day period is after the letter is sent, we watch for the next 60 days and see if problems are continuing, but the letter would have already been sent at that point. And so we are monitoring, you know, have they got the letter? Are they doing what we asked? Are they responding to us? Are they straightening things up? So there's not a 60-day waiting period to send the correspondence.
How quickly can we shut down stuff? Somebody just shut it down if it's a mess. Do you have to wait 6 days?
I have known law enforcement to go out and shut a situation down on site. Then if it happens again, they go out again and do it. Meanwhile, while that 60-day clock is ticking, they are vigilant about doing what they can in our communities. I mean, I can attest to that personally. Hopefully I answered your question. So if there's a call for service, law enforcement goes out. If sometimes they do undercover work. It might take a couple of days.
Shut down immediately.
Yeah, but the nuisance abatement process is a little bit different. But shutting down the actual crime and violence, that doesn't take too terribly long. And if you have a specific address, we'd be happy to look into it. We don't have to talk about it right now. Yes, ma'am.
But going back,
Mayor Pro Tem Burke.
we have been too long in closing down those. They've stayed sometimes 3 and 4 months, sometimes 6 months, and even a year. Sometimes we've had problems with that same piece of property. So the question that's asked about the 60 days really is something that you could look at.
Yes, ma'am.
Because that is long.
We'll look at it and we'll have a discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions on this matter? Okay, we've got 8 minutes. I think we need a little bit more, but we've got the last item on the agenda. Item G4, please.
Item G4, information on urban hunting opportunities.
All right, as Mr. DeCane gets his presentation queued up, we've heard lots about this. This is a innovative idea and thought process that happens in other cities. I think we might be the most major city to consider this in North Carolina, but it is considered in other cities and towns. So, Mr. DeCane, if you queue us up, please.
Yes, sir. Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Burke, members of the committee. I'm not feeling any pressure about the 8 minutes, but I think I can meet that deadline. A resident, Carolyn Fay, came to the committee back in November and presented the idea of an urban archery season in the city of Winston-Salem. The chairman is correct. We would be the largest municipality in the state to have such a program. It's actually a two-step process. So the first step is that the city sends a letter of intent to the state with a map of the corporate boundaries, and you have an urban archery season. In fact, hunting in the city is technically legal by state standards. Hunting is legal statewide. It's the local ordinances that prevent the use of weapons that disallows hunting, actually. So in order to get that letter of intent in and have the state basically accept it, they allow that from January to April. So that will be step one. Should the council decide they'd like to move forward with that, staff can go forward at any time. The hunting season that would be established by doing that would actually be the months of January and February 2020. So the ordinance portion of tonight's presentation, we have plenty of time to discuss that, but I will go through and answer some of the questions that came out of committee last time. It is available for cities. The whole idea is to reduce, we just talked about nuisances. Apparently deer are a nuisance. They can get into your gardens, they can cause traffic accidents, et cetera. And the intent is to reduce the urban deer population and prevent those things. There's no obligation for private landowners to allow hunting on their land. It is their choice. And it doesn't eliminate any of the ethical requirements for obtaining permission from a landowner. So just because the city says we have an urban archery season does not give you blanket authority to trespass. And hunters are required to obtain written permission to hunt on posted property. And I covered a little bit of that in some of the draft ordinance language. There are 61 North Carolina cities and towns participate currently as of this year. One of the questions was, what do other communities experience? So I contacted Kannapolis, Huntersville, and Concord. Their experiences collectively have been, there have been no citations for misbehavior or breaking the rules, no complaints from the residents about hunters, and they were shocked at the limited number of hunters that were actually taking the opportunity. So I think Kannapolis probably had the best record keeping of all of them. Huntersville is very loose. They don't really even have an ordinance. They just say you're allowed to use these and follow state laws. But they didn't see any results in a marked number of deer strikes with vehicles or anything like that. But it was an opportunity for their citizens, and they took it. And so far for those three communities is working out well. None have an ordinance linked to charitable organizations. Ms. Fay talked about Hunters for the Hungry. There is an opportunity to take advantage of that. My recommendation would be that before you put that in an ordinance here, let's allow one season of urban archery to take place, and then the state keeps very good records on the deer harvest. We could see how many deer were actually taken and see if there's a true benefit to that. So that would be my recommendation as a consideration in the ordinance. And there was a question about the general health of the deer population in our urban area. And the deer are not starving. They're not clawing at people's windows to get at the ferns. They're a relatively healthy population. So that's good news. This is a very difficult slide to read because it didn't look this way on the screen. So I'll just hit the highlights. The beginning is a definition of who a hunter is. They're licensed by the state. They have written permission to hunt on the property that they're on their person. They're, of course, going to follow all the local, state laws and ordinances. Crossbow and bow and arrow would be the only two weapons allowed to be used. We're recommending use from a 10-foot elevated platform. Purpose of that is if you're 10 feet high, you're shooting at a down angle, that limits the distance that an arrow can travel. There are some things that we should discuss in the coming year about distance from property lines or schools, churches, places where children gather, parks, playgrounds, etc. There, of course, would be no hunting to, from, across any public right-of-way or on a public land of any sort. Greenways, parks, school property, all types of public property. Hunting is allowed only on a tractor parcel of land, which is at least, and this is where every community, all 61 of them, differ on the size of the land or a combination of adjacent properties. The smallest was 1 acre, and the largest was 50 acres, I think, was the minimum. So those are things to consider. This map, the blue areas indicate 1 acre or larger size within the city. So you could do some serious urban archery hunting downtown. So keep that in mind. There are plenty of blue areas on here that you won't find any deer walking through. But You know, my recommendation at this point would be, you know, certainly an acre or larger to allow urban archery. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I think primarily if there's a consensus from the committee that they would like the manager to move forward with sending a letter of intent to the state, we could get that done. The ordinances that are in place now prevent urban archery hunting within the city limits. That'll give us time to develop the ordinance language, and then by the archery season of 2020, our citizens will be able to take advantage of that.
Mr. Kane, I think it's especially to point out, I know there are difference of opinions, but, you know, we're talking about deer stand or about a platform only.
Yes, sir.
No rifles, muskets, or anything like that. It's just only bow hunting. Well, you know, that's a type of hunting for powder. And so I feel like we certainly need to increase the acreage. I think if you look at that map, that does give us all a little cause for concern. Maybe we can raise the acreage where we limit it to certain areas, and particularly not downtown and where we have large centers of populations. But I think it's just a decent idea. It could create some more jobs by you know, we can have processing centers to pop up. It helps us all around the board. So let's do it. We've got a couple of minutes. Let's move around the table. I saw Councilmember Bessie's hand. I saw Councilmember Scipio. We'll do it. Councilmember Scipio.
I just have one question. How big a problem do we think we have with our deer population that we would need this?
We have a problem.
Well, there are accidents on
I know one or two incidents might be. I mean, how big a problem is it that we would need to have urban archery? That's just my question.
Mr. King.
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Scipio, the idea was brought forth by a citizen who was suffering property damage. It's difficult to tell how large of a problem it is. The term problem in this case is a relative term. If you're a nature lover and you love all animals, it's not a problem. You love to have them in your garden. You'll plant things that attract deer. To other people, they're destroying their property. As far as vehicle strikes, it's difficult to get a sound number on that because a lot of that is done by report. In my own personal experience, I hit a deer and I checked my car, I checked myself, I got back in, drove to work, and called my insurance company. So there's not even a report for that. And then I did not do that within the city limits. I was outside the city limits. So I throw that caveat.
It had to be up Reynolds Park Road if you did hit a deer.
Yeah, I'm sorry, full disclosure. But it was not a city vehicle. And so the problem question is a relative thing. According to the folks that I spoke to in the other communities, it came about basically the same way. Some of that was used as a reason to bring it forth, but it was really just a desire to be able to hunt.
Mr. Bessie.
Yeah, and I actually think that's correct. I don't think this is a particularly practical method for controlling deer populations in any significant way. And we don't have particularly a problem in Winston-Salem with, you might identify herd disease as an indication of serious overpopulation. We have some property owners who are annoyed that there are deer coming in and chewing on the shrubbery, and I understand. I'd like to suggest we include an exclusion from property adjoining parks, because looking at the map in parts of my areas, I can see where the only spots that are really attractive to a deer herd would be the city parks, and I really don't want folks doing a hunting stand 100 feet off the park and just waiting for someone to come over, and then maybe their aim's a little off and it goes shooting into the park.
Agreed. Councilman Adams.
As most of you know, I support this. Again, I believe that we can do something good here, provide protein for families that can't afford to go get, whether it's steak or Angus or whatever. I also believe we can help feed the homeless this way, again, protein. I also believe that if there's, we add, like Councilmember Taylor said, more than 3 acres to this deal, so that to ensure the protection of the urban populations that have density, but we're not really talking about the urban areas. We're talking about places within the city that are substantially rural, just about in every one of our wards at the back end of it.
Mm.
We have people that own 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 acres of land, and they want this. So I am a supporter of this, along with that criteria, because I definitely plan to get me some bow lessons, because I'm going for it.
Yes, ma'am.
Anyone else wish to be heard? Mr. McIntosh.
GMA 3. I mean, we're talking about non-urban, GMA 1, GMA 2, I think is really urban to have people shooting very lethal weapons. I would probably support a GMA 3 only presentation. I don't think it's going to really reduce the interaction between humans and deer. The regulations seem incredibly complex. How will this be policed? I mean, you're basically going to tell people, go out in the woods and don't get caught. Mm-hmm. So if it's GMA 3 where it really is suburban, ex-urban, I live in a neighborhood that's a mile and a half from Wake Forest campus, and there's 30 acres of woods around. I don't want people out there with a high-powered bow, compound bow, crossbow. I just think we're too urban a community in GMA 1s and GMA 2s for this to be a good idea to introduce that level of lethality.
And Mr. McIntosh, with that being said, I mean, that would be trespassing. And I think those who are hunters must get written permission from property owners. Everybody owns every piece of property in the city. I don't know any piece of property in the city that's owned by no one. Well, those are owned by and maintained by people.
He's right.
Yeah.
He's right.
So maybe we can exclude alleys. I mean, that's an excellent point. But for the most part, every piece of property is owned by someone. So, yeah, you bring up a valid argument, but if you've got written permission, you can hunt on private property only and not on city property.
To me, the crossbow is just as lethal as a rifle. And I know we're not going to authorize that.
I think that's an opinion that we differ on, but nevertheless, is there anyone else who wishes to be heard? What we're looking for, Mayor Pro Tem, we'll come to you, then Mr. Larson, is just general consensus on how we move forward or not move forward with this. It sounds like we're starting to gather consensus, if we can work out a few of the details, but we just need to know in the interest of time. Mayor Pro Tem Burke, Mr. Larson.
Quickly, I'm not saying for or against. The only reason I talked with the airport people about the deer was for the safety of airplanes coming in, and I saw a need there. But I think it's something that we need to be cautious and careful, because when you make a rule, sometimes people break it by going in areas that can be harmful for people who are coming and going.
Mr. Larson.
Yeah, we're opening up a whole new opportunity for hunting in the urban environment. Call it bows, call it crossbows, call it whatever. It is a highly populated area. There are deer around. I get all of that. Do we know any ideas of whether this new amendment on hunting rights in North Carolina affects any of our thinking on this matter?
It's my untrained legal opinion that it does not.
And do we even know how that's going to be applied yet, as to whether or not this is going to preempt any kind of local?
It will not preempt local ordinance.
Yeah.
You may have the right to hunt, but you just like anywhere you hunt now, you have to hunt within the rules of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So it's not just a hall pass to go out and hunt wherever you'd like by any means. So you still have to follow those laws.
We'll see how that shakes out. I think there's certainly a population that feels they're entitled to hunt anywhere. And when we open the door slightly, how we enforce it is a question in my mind. I would tend to agree with my colleague, Ms. McIntosh, regarding density of population areas and growth areas. And if you look at your map right up there, you can kind of see a donut of where the blue is and where the green is and where the population bases are. And I suggest we look carefully at whether it be the sizing of an acreage. But if you start looking at size and density, you're going to see very quickly that you're probably going to be forced out into growth area management area 3 or something like that anyway. But I do think that we need to have large enough masses. 1 acre is ridiculous. To think that you can hunt deer on 1 acre parcel. So I don't know what the right number is, Chairman, but if you start looking at the map and think about just drawing a circle in the middle and see where our growth areas are, it may provide some boundaries that we could actually live with and provide some recreational activities or hunting activities or food gathering activities, whatever we want to call it, in certain areas. But as the population expands, we're going to lose more and more of that green space. Every year we have more and more building going on, and we're going to see that contract. So how we deal with that, it may be a minimal acreage issue of adjacent property. So I'd recommend we bring it back again with a little tighter guidelines maybe. I want to be clear that this constitutional amendment does not impact what we're going to pass, that we're going to a lot of effort here, and they're going to preempt us in some way with some guidelines.
Yes, sir.
So Mr. DeCane, you've heard the council and the committee clearly. I just will add my opinion and we're done. I just think instead of designating growth management areas, I think it might just be more prudent to look at the acreage and then let the acreage decide where it goes. Because the truth of the matter is there are a lot of parts of this community, I'm thinking about the southeast, the north, and several others that were annexed into the city, not under their own will. And they want to hunt. They want to fish. They like doing outdoor activities. I think it's important that we accommodate them, but still protect the urban core. And I think by adding acreage instead of growth management areas, it might be a way to get two with one stone. No pun intended.
One other question I think was raised when this first came up. Is there a city of equivalent size to Winston-Salem that has imposed this? Nobody.
No.
So whatever we do here, could or could not set a precedent, but I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed.
And I don't want to let that limit us. In this city, we're trailblazers, and we got to benchmark other cities, but I'll be dog if we're not going to do something because other cities aren't doing it. I mean, somebody's got to do it, and not just this subject, but there are plenty of other subjects where we were a little bit more reserved because other cities weren't doing it. Well, they need to look at us sometimes, too. I think in the city we need to be leaders, and if this ain't what we need to lead on, that's fine. But if this is, let's lead and be trailblazers. So thank you for your presentation, Mr. DeCane. Let's bring it back for consideration based off the comments we've heard here today. So that completes our agenda. Are there any other items that should be considered for the good of the order? Seeing nothing further, we'll consider this meeting to be adjourned.